Hi, everybody. This is June 19th, 2026, or Juneteenth in the United States, which was the freedom from slavery of slaves in, I think, Texas, when they finally found out that the North, the Union, had won the Civil War. The highest death toll in American history of any war fighting to end slavery. 850,000 American citizens were killed. That's the price they paid to end slavery. And it was a moral fight. And the South lost because they were on the wrong side of the moral question of slavery. And Canada is in the same position now that this, with its euthanasia of 100,000 innocent, vulnerable Canadians, 45 Canadian citizens, 96% white, were executed today by lethal injection in Canada. I call it eBlick. So I've been posting these videos as a form of therapy to try and recover from the trauma of watching my little brother Paul Kieran's 64 with Down syndrome be locked away by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government, David Eby as leader, Nikki Sharma as Attorney General, and Sheila Malcolmson as the minister responsible for Paul's care. So the government, the New Democratic Party government, locked Paul away immediately after I complained when I discovered a secret and what I alleged to be a fraudulent forged power of attorney the government created to give Paul the COVID-19 shot in February of 2021. So they locked Paul away. I did everything in my power. I'm a former psychologist with mentally handicapped adults for the province of British Columbia. Then I went to law school. Then I was a federal prosecutor and a family lawyer for 23 years before I became disabled in an accident. So they locked Paul away, as I said, when I complained to the Burnaby RCMP, when I discovered this secret document that was, to me, I could see it was a forgery because I taught Paul to print the only word that he could ever read or print, his first name, Paul. It took me about a year as a little girl. They locked him away for 588 days. I did everything I could dream of legally and civilly to restore. I complained to the Human Rights Tribunal of British Columbia. They didn't even proceed until after Paul was dead. They actually had the gall to contact me after Paul had died. So I got a phone call. The government, David Eby and the New Democratic Party government, had appointed my then 82-year-old Catholic nun sister in 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's guardian. She had only met Paul on a few occasions. She moved out when he was born, whereas my sisters and I and my mother had cared for Paul on weekends and holidays. And I had Paul at my home on weekends until, as I said, I was disabled in an accident. So they locked Paul away, and I went to court. I did everything that you can do civilly to try and restore his freedom. I was his last surviving family member and local visitor, and he was my last surviving local sibling from a big family of 9 children, and my parents had passed away. So Paul was locked away in his group home for 588 days. Then I got an email from my sister's lawyer. I estimate the Catholic Church spent over $2 million on her legal representation. She did not create this fraudulent and forged document, but once I alleged, I accused her of relying on it, then they came out full bore in defense of her appointment as Paul's guardian. And every kind of illegal thing you could imagine, or an irregular thing. My documents, my binders of evidence disappeared off the judge who heard over 3 days my application to be appointed Paul's guardian. All of my evidence disappeared off his bench, off his desk. and the only thing that remained was the documents of the public guardian trustee of BC and the nun sister. She had two law firms working for her, one in Ottawa, Charles Gibson, and Borden Ladner Gervais, one of the biggest law firms, if not the biggest law firm in Canada. As I said, the Catholic Church spent over $2 million, I estimate over $2 million on her representation. But she never moved Paul to be closer to her in Ontario, and she never moved here to be closer to him. And on April 15th of 2024, I got an email from her Vancouver lawyer, Casey Deanshaw, saying Paul had had a stroke, but I could arrange a visit through him. So when she didn't tell, Paul had actually had a stroke on April 13th, but she didn't notify me for 2 days. So Paul lay alone in Burnaby Hospital by himself until she flew in. When she could see he wasn't going to die, she flew in. She didn't understand his speech or communication. She had only met him a few times over the course of his life. So she allowed me a 10-minute per day visit with Paul. And he appeared to be recovering remarkably well. When I saw him, he grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard I thought he was going to crush it when I said my name, Kathleen. And then I brought him a book that a neighbor gave me for him. He grabbed the book from my hand and turned the pages perfectly, scanned the pictures perfectly. He made good eye contact, and he appeared to be recovering. I mean, people don't really die of strokes anymore in Canada. Then on April 21st, about 6:30, I got a telephone call from a staff sergeant at the Burnaby RCMP saying that he'd been ordered by their Ottawa Oversight Agency to reopen their investigation into my allegation that the document the nun was relying on was fraudulent and forged. And I was so excited. I thought, finally, somebody's listening to me. And I went to court the next morning. I asked the judge to suspend the judge's guardianship over Paul pending the RCMP investigation. But we didn't get on. And when I got back to the hospital, all of Paul's medical supports had been removed, and he appeared to me to have been sedated to death. He had had an oxygen mask on the whole time, a ventilator with an oxygen mask, and intravenous, and all the normal medical supports. The nun had moved Paul into a room where it was only her and him. There was nobody else. And when I walked into the room, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She just said through gritted teeth, "Say goodbye to Paul, he's dying." Well, he appeared to me to be dead already. His eyes were wide open, his pupils were dilated and fixed, and his hand was completely still and cool. So I believe that she had ordered him to be sedated to death. And I know the treating doctor was Dr. Michael Baker. I've complained about him to the coroner and to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. I believe that when she found out that she was going to be investigated by the RCMP, she thought, well, if Paul's dead, that'll be the end of the investigation. And she was absolutely right. I never heard from the Burnaby RCMP again. They never interviewed me, even though I asked them to investigate Paul's death as suspicious. No one ever interviewed me until about 2 weeks ago. A corporal with the Burnaby RCMP left her card in my door asking me to contact her. And of course, I retained a lawyer, and the lawyer told her that all further communications had to go through him. So that's the background. And after I found out that I believe that they had done what the government calls, with their propaganda word, medical assistance in dying, I believe that my sister ordered this Dr. Michael Baker to kill my brother, even though one of the requirements of medical assistance in dying is that the person has to be mentally capable. And I have a certificate saying that Paul was not mentally capable. He had the IQ of a 15-month-old baby. And he really wanted to live. Paul loved life. Life had been so cruel to Paul with his Down syndrome and the way people treated him. But he carried himself with such dignity, and he loved life. I could see he was so frightened with her there, with that nun there. He knew what she was up to. and the look of fear in his eyes, I'll never forget. So after he was gone, then I started to look into this. I had retired as a lawyer in 2016, but I started looking into this euthanasia in Canada, which has exploded. It's by far the worst in the world. There's only four countries in the world that allow euthanasia that I'm aware of, and that's Switzerland, the Netherlands, Spain, and Canada. But Canada is by far the worst. So Canada has killed over 100, and I call it EBLIC, extrajudicial execution by lethal injection. And what it is any medical doctor or nurse, there's no legal involvement at all. It's completely extrajudicial. The person is not entitled to a lawyer or to independent legal advice, even though it's the state, it's the government that pays the doctor that kills. And doctors are not experts in killing people. They use the same technique for killing people, lethal injection, that is used to kill inmates in the states that have been convicted of capital offenses. And capital punishment, execution by the state, was outlawed by Parliament in 1976 for civilians, in 1999 for military. But not secretly, but anonymously and unanimously, in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada, with Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin as leader, anonymously released a decision reversing their earlier 20-year-old decision, saying that euthanasia was against the law and first-degree murder under the criminal code. That she changed it to make euthanasia. They said this was with respect to a woman who was already dead named Kay Carter. So it was a moot case, and Kay Carter had gone to Switzerland. She wasn't terminally ill. She had spinal stenosis. But this evil non-governmental organization called Death, with ghoulish organization called Death with Dignity, wanted to ram through. And I'm sure that the Communist Party of China was involved in this, and I'll explain why in a second. So they said, the Supreme Court of Canada said, with regards to a woman who was already dead, that it was not fair to her that she had to wait till she was terminally ill to be killed by a doctor. And they gave the government of Canada 12 months to come up with a system for legally killing people, extrajudicially executing people by lethal injection in a way that would not impinge on the rights of innocent, vulnerable, and already marginalized people, which, of course, in the 40,000 history of civilization has never been done. So, as I said, they developed the system where all it takes is 2 signatures on a piece of paper. It's not a sworn affidavit. It's not before a judge. There's no legal involvement whatsoever. Medical doctors and nurses, all it takes is a signature of any medical doctor or any nurse, and they're the judge, jury, and executioner. And recently in London, Ontario, a doctor interviewed a man who had Crohn's disease outside of a Tim Hortons, and then the doctor drove this person with Crohn's disease to the coroner's office and killed him there. A woman has refused to be killed, and they just went and found another person to sign the piece of paper and killed her anyways. And last year in the Vancouver General Emergency, where I've been many times, an 84-year-old woman went in with what turned out to be a broken tailbone. And they didn't even ask her what the problem was. The doctor came up to her and said, "We've decided to offer you MAiD." The last thing on earth you want, in my experience, is to have doctors as the judge, jury, and executioner in the state-sponsored extrajudicial execution by lethal injection. The worst mass killer in history, the worst serial killer in history, was a medical doctor named Harold Shipman in the United Kingdom. And the worst female mass killer in history was a nurse named Elizabeth Wettlaufer in Ontario, who killed 11 of her patients. Harold Shipman killed 250 of his patients. So, and I have had clients who are medical doctors, and they are the broad spectrum of humanity, from serial killer to wonderful people. But all of the provisions for protection of human rights that have been built into the common law of Britain since the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, all of the provisions for the protection of the individual but from the state are thrown out the window with this extrajudicial execution by lethal injection on the basis of so-called compassion. So that's what I've discovered since my brother, I believe, was murdered. And I maintain that my brother Paul Kearns was murdered. But today there are some developments that are good news and bad news that I wanted to share with you. The good news is that in this rapidly exploding expansion of this extrajudicial execution by lethal injection in Canada, where 96% of the people that are being killed are Canadian-born, white, of European descent. So it's eugenics and a genocide of an identifiable population of Canadian-born citizens. But today, the Liberal government, led by that evil little piece of shit, Mark Carney, wanted to expand the types of people that they kill to people who are only suffering from mental illness. And that did not pass today. They also want to expand it to so-called to children and to babies. They want to expand the types of people that they will kill. And I know how this is going to end ultimately, because my uncle Kevin landed on the beaches of Normandy 82 years ago, this coming June 24th. He landed as a replacement in the North Shore, New Brunswick Regiment, and he was wounded in Normandy and wounded again in Germany, liberating Europe from the Adolf Hitler and his genocidal mania. And then the people who perpetrated this were hanged at Nuremberg. So I know how it's going to end. But today, the conservative MPs were touting this as some huge victory that the Liberal government, this illegitimate, stolen majority by Mark Carney, did not get to expand extrajudicial execution by lethal injection in Canada to include people who are only suffering from mental illness. So that was their big victory. You know, I'm telling you right now, I'm a conservative, and nobody's fought harder for the conservative cause than me. But you got to do better. And the first question that Joe Rogan, the world's #1 podcaster, had for Pierre Poilievre was, what's going on with this euthanasia in Canada? And Pierre Poilievre answered, well, I believe people should have the right to do what they want. Give me a break, Pierre Poilievre. Get out of the way. If you can't do better than that in protecting Canadians from this extrajudicial execution by lethal injection, then let somebody take your place who will. So the good news is that the evildoers in Ottawa did not get to expand their euthanasia, their genocide, to people who are suffering from mental illness. And I can see that they can see the writing on the wall. This is it's a Holocaust and a genocide of my people. I'm exactly the kind of person they would like to kill. Disabled, elderly, white, Canadian-born citizen. So that is the good news. They did not get to expand euthanasia to people suffering from just mental illness. The bad news, however, is that this illegitimate majority, stolen by Mark Carney, by bribing or otherwise incentivizing 5 other members of parliament who were elected under other parties as members of other parties or candidates of other parties rammed through Bill C-22. And I've just spent a couple of hours with Copilot, Microsoft Copilot AI, on what bill, so I can tell you what Bill C-22 does. The gist of it is that it expands police powers into investigations, and it allows police to ask places like Rogers or Fido or TELUS whether or not somebody has an account with them, and the Rogers or TELUS or Fido have to answer yes or no. That's all the information they have to say is yes or no. And the only grounds required for the police to have to make this inquiry is a reasonable suspicion. So that's where it's not probable cause, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's not on the balance of probabilities. It's just a reasonable suspicion. And when I started as a federal prosecutor, one of my first cases, and it's a leading case in the area of unreasonable search and seizure, was Regina and Yetway Daniel Lee in 1992. And I argued that because the police saw the Danny Lee interacting with people in a suspicious way, and he had a bulge in his pocket, they believed that he had heroin for the purposes and cocaine for the purposes of trafficking, and they detained him and searched him. And Judge Sherman Hood, who I appeared before, said that they had what's called articulable cause. So they could articulate the reasons why they thought that he was engaged in criminal activity. And that's since been codified into something called reasonable suspicion. So the government of Canada has expanded the kind of searches that police can do into who has an account with various service providers, internet service providers. If all they need is a reasonable suspicion, they don't have to have probable grounds or probable cause, or all they have to have is a reasonable suspicion. So that may or may not be a good or bad thing, but what the Liberals did do is they rammed through this Bill C-22, expanding police investigative powers with no debate. Because they had this majority, this illegitimate, bought and paid for, bribed majority, they rammed it through with no debate in Parliament. So the good news today is that they did not get to expand extrajudicial execution by lethal injection in Canada to people suffering only from mental illness, but they did ram through the investigative powers of police to include, so that all they have to do is ask any internet provider, if they have reasonable suspicion, they can ask you, for example, about you, whether they can ask TELUS whether you've got an account with them, and TELUS has to say yes or no, with only a reasonable suspicion. And as I said, that may be a good or bad thing, but it was never debated. It wasn't up to, the debate was completely shut down by Mark Carney, that evil little piece of shit, Mark Carney, with his illegitimate majority. So that's it for today. I hope it's helpful and that it's expanded your understanding of what's going on in Canadian politics and law. I love you all. Take care, everyone.